Mr. Dingell?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I commend you for this markup today. We have a number of important bills before the committee. All these bills before us passed through this committee and passed the House overwhelmingly during the 110th Congress. So there's nothing new before us today. But then, as now, the Senate is the obstacle to getting these pieces of legislation enacted into law. It is also, of course, true that these legislations are the result of bipartisan deliberations. The arguments for and against have been heard by most of the members of the committee. The bills before us were not enacted, as I mentioned, because the Senate failed to enact them prior to the end of the 110th Congress. I am delighted, Mr. Chairman, that you have revisited these important pieces of legislation and that you are doing so quickly this session. And I want to applaud my colleagues for their continued persistence. We will hear today complaints that FDA does not have adequate resources to do a job, and that this is then an argument why we might not want to consider these pieces of legislation. Clearly this is erroneous, and clearly this is unwise and wrong, because if the agency lacks resources, which happens to be the case, it is the responsibility of this committee then to see to it, first, that it has the resources, second, that it has the powers, and third, that it has the authority to address the concerns that the people have with regard to safety of matters under the jurisdiction of that committee. And I would point out that we have legislation in this committee at this time which I and Mr. Stupak and Mr. Pallone co-sponsor, which would not only give authority, but which would give the financial resources to the Food and Drug Administration to do the job that it cannot and is not now doing. So we have two problems to address. Let us not cavil about one while we ignore the other. So, Mr. Chairman, I urge the favorable consideration of all of this legislation. As a matter of fact, it is so neatly done, and it has been so well handled in the committee during the previous session that we could almost consider it in block by unanimous consent, but I'm sure there'd be somebody who would object. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dingell. I should have asked unanimous consent, but we're already on track.